Okay.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Eddie. Just on the subject of jackets, before I begin, I was slagged off coming in for wearing a suit and tie and in the summertime. And just to remind you all, the reason I'm doing it is to show respect. Show respect for Joe, for Eddie, for Charlie, for the Clares, and all the people who make this happen. One of the jobs I have is with the United Nations, and I go around as part of a post-conflict unit. So I go and see places after humanity has done the worst it can do to each other, and you realise how bad can get. And you come back to this soft, gentle, kind country, and you think, do you know, this could just be as good as it gets. We need to think about that from time to time. And one of the things that makes it this good and keeps it this good, and the emphasis on the word keeps it this good, is this type of event. And one of these things allows us to regularly speak truth to power, as we saw last night, and power have truth spoken at it. One of the things it allows us to do is to outrage each other with our debates and say things that might be foolish. And in all of it, it gives us the right from time to time to be wrong, the right to be wrong. The right to be wrong has limits. And that's really the theme I want to start off on today, is our right to be wrong. There you go. We are in the middle of a year when grievous self-harm has been inflicted on itself by our nearest neighbour, as I know that you gave Neil Holland a clear message about on Monday night. In the United States, it's arguable the same thing is happening. Planning is one of those things where a huge number of people have strong opinions about, and yet very few people are influenced by, or indeed even aware of, the facts. The self-harm that you can do to yourself with bad planning is catastrophic. And one of the reasons that I'm happy to be able to talk tonight here this afternoon is that we are about to embark upon a national planning framework in Ireland, which many tidy-minded people think is probably a good idea. Well done, it could well be. But badly done, it's one of the greatest forms of self-harm that a country can do to itself. And those of you who are going for a swim tomorrow morning, as Joe recommends, down to Portnew, as you go outside the village here on the left, you'll see a half dozen houses boarded up, Glenty's very own ghost estate. Remember the incredible harm that we visited upon our own economy, that destroyed us and made the John Morans of this world have to drop everything and come and rescue us, was driven by planning, was driven by an approach of thinking, if we build it, they will come. If we encourage the people of Galway and Mayo and Leitrim to build more and more houses, surely the jobs and the people will follow that and stop the slow leakage of population. But of course it didn't. It destroyed them, and it destroyed us. We could be about to embark upon the same thing. So I'm giving you, this bunch of thoughtful people here today, a series of questions so that when the next national planning framework comes out this week or next month, you will be able to ask the kinds of questions that need to be asked. Because this new national planning framework will be like something we've never had before. It will be a statutory plan, adopted by both houses of the Oireachtas. No local authority, no town council, no regional assembly in Ireland will be allowed to adopt a plan that does not conform with this. It better be right. So just to start off with a very small primer about planning. I'll be finished the housing agency at Christmas, and my extraordinary pain over the last 5 years in that job has been to realise that because everybody lives in a home of some type or a house, they all think they're an expert in it. And I'm always surprised that things like the MacGill school don't have taxi drivers and hairdressers up here telling you, because they appear to know far more than everybody else about what these subjects should be doing. Similarly with housing, everybody in the country has an opinion about housing. There's a lot of facts about housing out there. Very few people know about them, and even fewer people care about them, and even people like the housing agency have trouble banging on the doors of ministries, indeed, trying to tell people what should happen. As for planning, There are almost no firm grasps on the facts, and my plan this afternoon, in the short time I have, is to give you a few of those facts so that you can think for yourselves, so you can be critical yourselves of what we're going to have put on us. The first thing I want to remind you about is that the word planning is used by everything from somebody who is planning to cut out the material from a dress to somebody who is planning a motorway system for an entire country. So the first rule, Planning 101, is to understand there are different scales of planning and different rules at each end. Throughout the consultation papers for the National Planning Framework, the Department over and over again uses the word shaping our future. And it carries with it the idea that somehow or other we can mould the future of Ireland like a potter might when making a piece of pottery. That may be true for small, discrete items like a town square or a village plan, where you can be prescriptive and specific. It is not applicable when you get to the stage of a national plan, a national strategic plan. At a national and strategic plan, there are two things that are critical. The obvious one is that it's high level and generalized. The most surprising thing is that the higher you go with plans, the greater the role that emotion takes, and the smaller the role that logic takes. In Ireland, we frame our emotions formally through politics. We use words like fair. That's not fair. It's not fair what happened to the counties west of the Shannon as a result of the oversupply based on bad plans. That was not fair, and it had real and practical consequences for hundreds of thousands of our citizens. In the Housing Agency, we regularly say to policymakers who talk about the fact that we might build 20 or 30,000 houses this year, we say to them that there are still 200,000 houses in Ireland who are in arrears. 200,000 households who cannot lie straight in bed at night with worry. That's an emotional issue. It's a factual issue. It's a practical issue that came about by bad planning. So, the first guidance we're giving you about planning is that at a strategic level, the trick is to know what you can do and what you can't do. And high-level strategic plans must engage the emotional, must engage the political, but it must be underpinned by facts. So the shaping of the country's destiny by a plan is not an appropriate verb to use. You cannot shape a population telling this group of people that we want you to go and live in Donegal, and you to go and live in Wexford, and you to go and live somewhere between Athlone, Tullamore and Mullingar. That's not going to work. You cannot tell industries to do that. You cannot tell water to flow uphill. You cannot tell the soils of Meath to transpose themselves to the outskirts of Glenties. These are not things you can tell or make or shape to happen. The first thing you do with high-level strategic evidence is you look at the evidence, accept it, and use that as the basis for your plan. The best you can do is give general guidance, general indications like the Garda Síochána saying, we don't know where that truck came from, we don't know where this car is going to, but you're turning left at the next junction, and that's as much as we can do to guide you, to serve you in getting better into the future. So, in terms of that word shape, the reason I'm using this image behind of a small boat on a storm-tossed sea is that the first thing you have to understand and accept is the extent to which you can do anything about Ireland moving out into the world. One of the most open economies in the world, fantastically flexible and responsive, wonderfully able to carve its way in this turbulent future we're going into. But at the same time, the skipper of that vessel has got to understand the limitations, and the limitations are wind and wave or things that come at us. We don't generate them. So the most important thing in planning is to understand what you can control, what you can modify, and what you must respond to. And at a fundamental level, this lies at the heart of any efforts to make a strategic plan for Ireland. One of the things that we need to do when we make any plan is to define success and to have a clear idea in our minds of where we think we're going with it. The reason that particular slide behind me has that group of people, they're from Regeneron on the outskirts of Limerick, is to remind ourselves before we do anything, like the surgeon, first do no harm. First, appreciate the remarkable country we live in, not just in terms of its kindness, not just in terms of its compassion, but also in terms of its ability to continually compete successfully with countries all over the world who would give their eye teeth to get the foreign direct investment to come and stay and thrive here as they do. So the first thing we need to do is to do no harm to our incredible successes, and not just make sure that they stay, but that they are sustained and they thrive. And we have got to test our plans by asking ourselves, will this take us closer to that or further away? It also involves embracing truths, acknowledging that some things are givens and some things are facts, and that they will not bend to the force of political or social will. In my work as an environmental consultant, I sat, I won't name where, but in a western town, explaining that the geology under a particular part of the town was rated as being highly unsuitable for development because of the underlying geology. I was interrupted by a member who proposed to the chairman that we change the rating of the geology under the town. One of the biggest problems we have, one of the greatest frustrations for myself as being somebody who has skin in the game, I've been involved in planning my entire adult life, is the extent to which every single day when planners all over the country set out to go to work, they go to work to deal with people who are tilting at windmills, at myths, at suppositions, as things that are classified as everybody knows. So, for instance, our national planning framework begins with the words, we can no longer adopt a business-as-usual approach. Really? Half the countries of the industrialized world would give their left hand to achieve what we've done, and we don't think that business-as-usual approach should be sustained? Well, let's make sure that at the very least we keep that before we embark on any other brilliance. The usual ones, that Dublin is the problem, it's taking all our women, our jobs, our money, our people, our investment, that the housing and transport can't absorb the growth, that it's a low-density city, that it's badly planned, that it's overdeveloped, that people don't use cars properly. These are all unquestioned. Every one of these things is untrue. Every one of these things is a myth. And I'm going to lay those out for you in the remaining 5 minutes. Will the National Planning Framework promise these unicorn-like solutions, balanced regional development, counterbalancing Dublin, make all the jobs go west, make all the roads and houses and railways go west? This will somehow or other solve the problems. These are myths. So, just very quickly, looking at the myths. Cities of Ireland, Dublin, 500,000, Cork, 119,000, Galway, 75,000. You can read the list for yourselves. However, the rest of the world have definitions for what constitutes a city or a town or a village or a Shroud Valya, as we call it here in Ireland. And we say that you get to be a metropolis when you're between 1 million and 3 million people, or a large city between 200,000 and 1 million people, or a city over 100,000 people. That's our list there behind us. We comfort ourselves. Looks familiar. I'm sure you're all happy with it. One for everybody in the audience. Guess what? You're wrong. Here's a list of Ireland's cities. No, that's different. You didn't mention Northern Ireland. Well, now, we've spent all week talking about Brexit, lads. That's the list. That's the list. And you suddenly find that a city like Galway has gone from its comfortable place in third down to somewhere around about 8th when you put in the places like Craigavon and Newton Abbey. Where the hell is Newton Abbey? Right? That's Ireland. That's the Ireland we live in. That's where the television sets are on. That's where the pints of milk are being sold. That's where your business, if you have a business, is going to sell and address things. That's Ireland. Do you know that Ireland? If you're making a plan for Ireland, you better be making a plan for that Ireland, or you're planning to fail. In his closing days as Minister for Housing and Planning, Minister Coveney, this is his quote, "My rule of thumb is that over the next 20 to 30 years, effectively we want to attempt to double the size of all the cities in population terms outside of Dublin." I charitably did not take that to mean he wants everywhere except Dublin to grow at twice that size. And the illustration on the left is from a report, a much criticised report that DIT brought out called Twice the Size. And in it, we examined what would happen if the various cities and regions in Dublin grew from their current levels to twice the size. So here's a table showing what would happen if things went to twice their size. And the most remarkable thing about it is that Dublin to Belfast corridor grows to be a prodigiously sized conurbation of two metropoli, having an effective population and market of 6.5 million people. 6.5 million people. That's a market of scale and substance. The Greater Dublin area, if you doubled that, just that part alone, would be nearly 4 million people. But the interesting thing is the direction of the rest of the arrows, how that middle band stays the same size, even if you doubled them. Even if you doubled them. Even if you doubled them. And with that doubling, places like Galway and Waterford go from being large towns to cities. But Belfast, the Greater Belfast, and the Greater Cork remain in the bands they're currently in. So in terms of trying to think what we're going to do with our investment, in terms of trying to think what bang we might get for our buck, these are the questions we have to ask. What do we get as a reward for our investment? The other great myth is unbalanced development, that we've got rural decline caused by things like being neglected and not enough expenditure on industry or infrastructure, and also that Dublin is the problem again, taking everything, giving nothing. These are myths. These are not true. The real cause of imbalance in Ireland, and if you look at a map of our population distribution, you will certainly find that it is unbalanced, is caused predominantly by a single factor, which the most famous expert on in Ireland is sitting to my left about, which is that we have, and we still have, the most centralised democracy in Europe. I spent 6 years of my life as a member of the Devolution Commission, interviewing Secretary General after Secretary General. Not one of them could identify a single solitary function that could be removed from a central government department and be relocated to a regional and local authority. We make Spain in the 1920s look socialist. What flows from that is a thing called a primate city. Primate cities are a typical feature of highly centralised bureaucracies that produce countries with a single dominant city and a number of other smaller ones. It's not a problem, it's just a type. Some people have red hair, some people have brown hair, some people have black hair. Some countries have primate cities, other countries don't. I'll show you the map in a minute and show you can see how common they are in Europe. Modernisation of agriculture is the real cause of the so-called decline of rural areas, and we can talk very briefly about that, it's never discussed, and the urbanisation of the population is the other part that goes with that. The last census of Ireland showed that all of Ireland urbanised dramatically in the last 10 years, and not just Dublin grew. So in terms of these various factors of demographics and geography and agriculture and governance, but especially in terms of external events, we in Ireland can do almost nothing to control those things, and we would be unwise to think that any kind of a planning framework will correct those things that are beyond our control. Oh, why is this doing? Go away. So, primate cities, looking at Dublin there. Dublin shares characteristics with, for instance, France, Austria, Hungary, countries that have a single primate city and a range of other smaller cities. It's a completely normal type of urban distribution in the rest of Europe, completely normal. And to say that there's something wrong with this country because of one large city and a series of other smaller cities is a myth. It's an easy thing to say. It has no basis in functional reality or political normalcy. The real big driver of this change in Ireland is the decline of agriculture. The top one there shows the percentage of people involved in agriculture and the percentage of our GDP that's contributing in agriculture. Agriculture is changing. The bottom map there shows, the bottom graph shows herd size and number of holdings. Agriculture now is maybe 2 or 3% of the national economy, 4% of the national GDP. Add in food products and things like that, you might get up to 6%, but they're declining shares of the national economy. It's economies of scale, it's economies of the modernisation of agriculture that's changing the countryside. It has got nothing to do with planning and nothing to do with Dublin. The population distribution, as you can see there, is reflecting the agricultural areas. And this map down below, for instance, of environmental designations is an indication of the fact that the country is asymmetrically designated in terms of sensitivities. Extreme difficulties of carrying out agriculture and many other practices on the west, and much, much less so in the eastern part of Ireland. The bad Dublin of sprawl, being overdeveloped and unsustainable, are also myths. These comparisons that you can see on the board there show that, for instance, compared to Amsterdam, Dublin in all its various different rings has exactly the same densities as Amsterdam that we're all meant to admire. The myth of Dublin being a place that uses, or Ireland being a place that uses public transport unsustainably. The little diagrams there, the red arrow is Ireland. Ireland is a very low ownership per 1,000 people of cars compared to the rest of Europe, has a very high level of use of public transport compared to other countries in Europe. Certainly we use them much more than places like Germany and France. These are myths. The myth that you hear every lazy journalist in Ireland using, that Dublin occupies the same amount of land as Paris. Absolute toss. Never looked at. That's a map of the outskirts of Paris and its environs, and it's a 50-kilometre by 45-kilometre rectangle. Dublin itself fits into about 15 by 25 kilometres at its most extreme. Exactly the same dimensions as Copenhagen, same population, exactly the same. And we're supposed to take all of our planning students to Copenhagen to see perfect planning. Exactly the same issues, exactly the same successes, and exactly the same problems. We're normal. We're normal. Big cities normally have problems with congestion. Big cities normally have problems with the housing being expensive. Big cities normally have problems of people saying, I wish I could have a cheaper apartment, or my kids could get onto the housing ladder faster. These are normal problems. We are a normal country dealing with normal issues. In terms of sprawl, have a quick look at Dublin there with our 1.9 million people. Compare ourselves to the sprawl of supposedly Newcastle with less people, and there's a sprawly city. Look at Copenhagen, the same area. Look at Hamburg, the same area. Look at Bordeaux. Look at tiny San Sebastian. You realise we're a normal city. These are the things that happen all over Europe. And not just all over Europe, but even within Ireland, when we look at the so-called sprawl of Dublin and see these maps here that show where people work and live, the sprawl supposedly of Dublin, there's the big dimensions of that. Do you know what? It's exactly the same distance that people travel around Cork and Galway and Limerick. Normal. There just happens to be a lot more people doing it in Dublin. But human beings travel the same distance to and from work everywhere in Ireland. It's normal. So, getting back to the closer issues, what we really need to be doing, and I'm getting 2 slides from the end, is addressing the real issues and not the myths. So instead of promising endlessly that we're going to do something about the fact that rural Ireland has fewer and fewer people and fewer economic opportunities, what would happen if we said, this is a normal thing that happens everywhere in the world, and we're going to make a plan for those rural transitions? When I find myself way up in the north of Sri Lanka, or up in the north, it's always the north, of Myanmar, or out in the mountains of Afghanistan or Nepal, the same thing is said to me in every village, everywhere in the world. The young people are all leaving. They only come back for the festival season. There's no bus anymore. We've lost our post office. If only we had a factory in the village, it might keep a few people. Everywhere in the world, because everywhere in the world is discovering more and more food can be produced by fewer and fewer people for less and less money. So the original underpinning of the fabric of the countryside, which used to be agriculture, doesn't exist anymore. And it's not coming back. We can make a plan for that. In first year in planning, what I teach my planning students is that the verb plan means to make preparations for future events. For future events. This is definitely happening. It will not be stopped. The first thing we need to do is make a plan for a future that we can't stop. And when we finish doing that, we can make other plans that integrate other things that are definitely happening. Like the huge sprawl of environmental protection that's happening along the West Coast. That's not being coordinated with anything else. Like trying to get the Atlantic and Belfast corridors that are growing up coordinated with each other instead of with themselves. Trying to get our Midland regions to operate as a single coherent unit. Try and get our transportation and infrastructure provision coordinated with these urban regions that are emerging. And try to get the Greater Dublin region, this massive region that's the seat of our economy and our wealth, integrated properly instead of fighting with the other regions. So these are the things that are going to change. This is the map that Eddie talked about. That's where the future population of Ireland are going to live. You may not like it, you may not be comfortable with it, But that's where the girls with their little pink ovaries already live, and that's where they're going to have their babies, and they're the heirs that are going to grow, and that is a fact. It is a fact that that will need to be serviced by transportation and infrastructure corridors. It is a fact that that's going to change the administrative structures. We're going to continue to need a filigree of very fine-grained political and administrative units in the western parts of Ireland and coarser and larger ones as you go across the country. And they, in turn, will produce naturally city regions around them. And these are realities that we're going to have our political and our administrative heads wrapped around. So what I'm trying to plead with the government to do is not to make one plan, but to make many plans that will be resilient under a range of scenarios. And we've heard at the beginning of the week of just how dramatically different some of those scenarios could be under something like Brexit. We need multiple plans that are resilient under multiple strategies. And we need to remember how little control we have over the factors that will drive us out into that future. Almost all of them are out of our control, except for one. Governance. Governance is the one thing that's completely in our own control. May we have the wit and the wisdom to manage that. So Eddie is talking tomorrow about that. If you only listen to one session this week, listen to that. Thank you.
Thank you.